Well, hello everyone. We are here. I appreciate you being part of the ID book club where we have been going through Cathy Moore's Map It, and we are finally at the end of our journey, and it's been fantastic getting to share that time with you all. We still have one final section because we are taking a look at Map It chapters 13 through 14, the very end of this process, and what a process it has been. And as always, we'll do a quick recap, then jump into some discussion tables, see what insights we can bring from your own experience, and hopefully wrap it up nicely and celebrate since we've finished reading another awesome text from Cathy Moore, who's helped us along our ID journey and process and everything in between. So at this point, we have spent the time identifying the performance issue, the thing at the center of it all. We have kept the business goal front and center all along in every conversation, every form of questioning we've had with subject matter experts and clients. We've helped them see the value in this action mapping process. We've designed activities after coming up with those specific actions. We've thought through the plot and story and narrative of decision making points. And if that sounds like a lot of work, it's because it was. But that's the nice thing is, in short, we've done all the hard work up front so that now here on out we can focus on the last few pieces that matter and really can come to that determination of how do we prototype and outline and get things going in terms of implementation. But most importantly, we've been focused on performance all along. How do we actually measure those metrics and see that through evaluation? And that's where we're headed today. And so considering all of that, one thing that Cathy starts us off with reminding us is if we are going to prototype, we can get distracted quite easily. In fact, talking about distraction, she reminds us of one key thing is we have to keep the cognitive challenge of whatever decision-based activity we've been designing all along and trying to develop over the course of this action mapping process to make that performance issue hopefully go away or at least minimized. But we have to focus on that cognitive challenge over bling, if you want to call it that. That's where she uses. And to do so, here's what she suggests. Our goal in prototyping is to let stakeholders see for themselves that you don't need time-wasting bling when the challenge is interesting, right? Focus on the challenge and trying to address the problem, not what it looks like. I mean, we'll go as far as to say, hey, we can keep things pretty much like black and white, very, one, less info over focus on the decision, but also less visual focus on all of the other elements we might see in a final product, which is totally fair to say, because overall, just how we've been focusing on how stakeholders can get all caught up with the information and distracted by the information, they can also get distracted by incomplete visuals or the color choices for this button or that button. That's not where we're at right now in the prototyping stage. We need to help them see, how does this work? Don't get distracted by the bling, like she says, but focus on the challenge. In fact, that's kind of where we're going there. Let's develop a prototype that works. And we do that by first providing direction without distraction, right? Giving an indication of this is the way we're going to be going with this activity that would hopefully solve that performance problem without getting caught up in all the details. So that goes on the visual front. That can go for any other key details or inner workings. Now we want to have a prototype that works, but certainly doesn't need to lose our focus on the action and on the performance issue. And so Cathy suggests focus on the challenge, focus on how information is provided, and focus on how feedback works within this activity, right? Provide direction without distraction. If we do need to deal with the visual design element here, we can keep things vague. Use like a mood board, she suggests, which I thought was pretty helpful there. Instead of actually implementing all the colors, design choices on the prototype, well, here's a separate mood board that might help us avoid getting hung up on all the specifics, because you can just see, the client looking at that visual indicator first before actually recognizing the challenge and the decision points and the feedback that's there. And just to be fair, with this prototyping, it's not just having a product that works, it's also being prepared for the questions that are going to come, right? The questions, the concerns that are going to come with seeing this prototype. This might not be what they're expecting, especially if action mapping is new or different for your organization, but have those concerns or questions already covered and taken care of by having performance-focused rationale. Always go back to the performance, always go back to the challenge, always go back to those decision-making points that the learner is going to have to go through to ensure that it's not about the visuals, it's not about the bling, it's about the challenge, and that's what's going to make this prototype work, and that's what's going to make the final activity work as well, right? And as she gives us those points, there's one thing, too, in particular that we have to do before we actually see this prototype in action, and that is to get reactions, right? And that's to get reactions from both the subject matter experts, that's to get reactions from the client, and getting those reactions isn't just us hoping that they're going to go for it. It's anticipating that there may be objections, but again, going back to the performance, being able to address those objections, and ultimately saying that, let's see if this prototype works before learners, because that is who is at the center of this training to begin with. That's where the behavior changes happen. That's with the audience with whom the performance issue will hopefully be addressed. So we want to move on to the learners. But another thing that she does talk about here is before we talk about the learners, talking to the clients, talking to the subject matter experts, our main goal, again, is to guide, to be performance consultants, not just training builders, order takers. And so in order to emphasize that further, she reminds us that, hey, your main goal is to have them, the clients, the subject matter experts, experience for themselves the realizations about action mapping and the value of action mapping, like see it for themselves. So we do that by asking questions. We do that by challenging some of the assumptions that they're already making, and not just caving in and changing the prototype after all this work we've already done with the action mapping process at this point. So we want them to experience for themselves, because that's where they're going to see value. That's where they're going to see hopefully the effectiveness of this activity, which is based on, again, a business goal that's trying to be addressed and a performance issue that we're trying to solve. So with all that in mind, we have to prototype, but in order to really make sure that prototype is going to get us to that final product before we implement, we need to do some testing. And that testing needs to help us try to perfect. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. We understand that. But at the same time, we have to know our audience. Like, who are you testing this before? You can give it to the subject matter expert and the client to go through themselves, sure. But that's not the real test. The real test is a sample focus group, or maybe a couple different groups of the population who you're really trying to serve and get to experience that decision-making point to change their behavior on the job. And so we've talked about this all along. Cathy's been really great about re-emphasizing, like, avoid this one-size-fits-all approach. Know your audience, know who they are, know who they need, and know what they need, and who isn't maybe involved even in this training. That's going to give us a lot of key indicators on how this prototype is going to actually be developed and turn into a final product. We need to get feedback on all sorts of aspects of this, multiple choice based decision point we've been focusing all along with this activity, where we need to ask them and let them experience the decision points and talk to them about the plot of the narrative and the dialogue that's incorporated in there. Is it realistic or not? Does it seem like something you would see on the job? And the production as well, like how it's structured and organized, how it's portrayed on the screen if we're doing e-learning or even in a live training event, how that can be perceived by the audience there. Get feedback on all those pieces, because the one thing we don't want to do is avoid any form of critique. That's what this is all about. The testing, we got to welcome that critique. We have to invite that critique, as Cathy says, because let's be honest, if you've gone through this whole action mapping process, been reading along with us all along, not talking about the problem doesn't solve the problem. And we've been committed to being problem solvers. So not addressing it is probably why the problems happen in the first place, right? So we don't want to do that with our own training and testing and prototyping. We want to refine this to be the best product it could be. And we do that by inviting critiques, not avoiding them. And I know that makes sense, but at the end of the day, it's difficult because, we want to have pride in our product, but at the end of the day, it's not about us. It's about, can we solve this business problem? We prototype, we refine, we get feedback with the appropriate audiences and learners who might be going through the training eventually in this final form. But what do we do with the next steps? We've getting really, really close to implementing, but before we do, we need to make sure that everything else is approved, everything else is processed, and she suggests making an outline, which I don't know about you, but I need help with this question. Why outline? Because as I'm thinking about that question, that's like the last thing you want to do, right? Most of the time you're like, okay, I'm ready to go. Let's get this in action. Let's build it, develop it, put everything into its final form and those refining moments. But outlining is so important. So let's talk about why that might be a helpful thing we need to consider. I think, first of all, it keeps the solution in focus, right? If we have the solution up at the top of that outline, you're reiterating over and over again, you're taking ourselves away from maybe the visual aspect of like the prototyping or mood board or thing like that, and remind ourselves of why we're doing this, keeping that solution in focus through this outlining process. And Cathy gives us a nice step-by-step way of doing so I can encourage you to look in the book and look through her examples. I think that's the most helpful tool you can use for this outlining process. But if you're passing this off for final approval, letting them see the solution is going to hopefully get you more approval, because that's what it's all about, right? It also connects the activities themselves as we outline each activities to those performance objectives, reminding that it's all about performance. It's all about coming to the solution for whatever the performance problem was. And it allows us to be more flexible because, let's be honest, we spend all the time and effort finalizing a product and then it doesn't get approved, we're going to be a lot less likely to want to make changes. The changes that probably need to be made, the appropriate changes that need to be made for this performance problem to truly be addressed in our training activities to actually align with them, allows us to be more flexible by having an outline, less time commitment. And hey, who doesn't like saving time? I think just sometimes we don't like to do the outlines, which I understand. I get that completely because that's where I'm at too. But that's the logical next step. Outline it, make sure that everything is aligned with those performance objectives. We want to make sure this training is effective. And that really leads into the next point, because how do we know that the training is effective? How do we know that that's going to get to the point? Well, first we do some designing that actually gets done. Meaning we may struggle with this process. The design process could take a long time, but Cathy has some suggestions for us. Action mapping's all been about pretty quick, targeted, focused responses to this problem, and doesn't take a long time, or shouldn't take a long time. So she suggests work and write in small batches. Focus on these couple activities and then try to, put them out there, produce them as they're approved, work in small batches rather than try to get the whole thing done at once. Again, that helps with that flexibility point that we just made earlier. Lets us be willing to change things when we're going to see a better result and outcome with that performance result. And then again, just as a reminder, we've seen this in other slides too, don't forget who's at the center of these activities and performance solutions. The learner. So while we're designing, we have the learner in mind. While we're developing each of these activities after we've gotten final approval, we are reminding ourselves of the feedback that we just got from the testing of the prototype that went on. To ignore all that would not help us in the slightest. So that's why this action mapping process is a process, and we do need to go in these steps in that way to get to where we need to be. And so we make a prototype that works, we do some designing that actually gets done, and the last piece comes down to the part that we often ignore the most. And that's unfortunate. And I'd love to hear your perspectives and reactions on that when we get in these discussion groups talking about this final piece, because Cathy gives us one suggestion here is we have planned from the beginning for evaluation. From the start, by setting our business goal. If that's been the center, the target of our action map, like the whole visual of our action map with our actions associated with that performance issue and business goal in the center, with our activities attached to those actions, it's in the center, it's the focus. We have planned for evaluation from the very start because we've all been all about business goals. And so to stop here and not do any form of evaluation is not committing to the full process. We have to look at the metrics to know, did this action mapping work? Did these activities actually help? And so in order to do so, we have to focus on evaluation that measures. And that might take form in a couple of different ways. As you're thinking about your group there, let's take a look at these. Because with your organization, you might already have things in place for evaluation, or maybe nothing at all. But here's some things that she suggests with some caveats, because we do want to make sure that this is effective evaluation. One, we might first consider not just assessment, oh, hey, you've done the training activity, let's take a test. That's kind of following a little bit more of the school model that we're trying to get away from. But if we have the spaced assessment that repeatedly tests to see, does this have longevity? Has this have a performance increase over the course of time? That's what we're looking for with this action mapping process, not just a one-time, one solution, that's it. We want to see more than that, right? So spaced assessment might work. When we talk about evaluation, oftentimes it comes down to the one thing that we know probably deep down, it might not be super effective. Those are smile sheets, we know. But Cathy suggests we can have effective smile sheets. Doesn't get in that too much, but we're asking the learner, the one who went through this training experience, not about their feelings. I mean, there might be some validity in that. We don't want to forget that. But more importantly, how have they seen this activity impact their performance on the job, right? We can come to a determination there with those questions. We come up with an evaluation with smile sheets that actually is performance centered as well. Talk to managers about behavior reports. That's what this process has been all about, right? Looking for those key actions and behaviors that we need to change and improve on. Well, because we spent all the hard work making sure that these are observable, measurable business objectives, we have that to go off of. And that should honestly be fairly simple to see. Is it impacting it or not in the way we expected? So that we can go back and iterate on those training activities or produce more if we need to. And of course, looking at the learner decisions. If this is more like an e-learning type of activity where we really focus and honed in on those decision points and making sure that they're making the correct decisions, even with not dumping a bunch of knowledge on them and information on them, that's going to give us the feedback we need if we're able to gather those through, use of a LMS and looking at those data points and measuring those metrics there just by their learning decisions alone. And so as we think about evaluation, there's several methods there. And I want to talk about that further in discussion groups and see what you've experienced in your own organizations too. But at the end of the day, as we get to the very end of this text, the process is never over, and then there's going to be another performance problem. We get that. But this is Cathy's hopes that she leaves us with, and leaves me feeling a little hopeful too that we can get there too. And this might sound like fantasy. This might sound like an imaginary world where all things are perfect, and that's true. But isn't that what a goal is? Is that we're shooting for that? We might not get there the first time, but if we continue through this process and practice it and get to be masters over that format she lays out for us, then we might see things like this, like Cathy suggests for us. Our client's going to respect us as a performance consultant, not a training order taker. Your SMEs are going to be proud of their contributions to the project. Like, again, that sounds like fantasy land, right? But if they definitely are invested in this process through action mapping, you're going to see a better result there too. Not only the client and the SME are we focused on, but your learners are going to be enjoying your challenges and confidently using what they've learned to solve problems that they care about. And overall, going all the way back to the center of the target, your organization is going to be seeing measurable improvements in metrics that matter. Metrics that matter, right? Well, we can gather data all day long, but looking at that performance issue and actually seeing metrics that have improved over time, that's been the goal of this all along. That's why we've done action mapping, and that hopefully is where we'll get to if we've implemented this the right way. Again, it's going to take some practice. Those might be ideals, but we can get there. In fact, we get there by talking it through. And so next steps here, I got 3 thought questions for you that I'd love to hear your perspectives on as we jump into those discussion table groups for a little bit, talk it through and share our experiences, share our insights, and hopefully we'll come back together and have some volunteers share out with us what they found. So really 3 key things that I thought would be helpful to focus on. And that is this. 1, how do we keep prototypes focused on challenges over bling, right? Because we want to make that look impressive and really get buy-in because of the way it looks. Well, how do we maybe avoid that? How do we address some of the pushback? Cathy goes through a lot of those questions and challenges we might face, but have you dealt with that yourself, and how do we maybe overcome prototyping to the extreme rather than prototyping simplistically to focus on the challenge and what really needs to happen at the end of the day with this activity and training? What about how do we keep evaluation centered and focused around performance? We can evaluate all sorts of different aspects of these trainings. Again, we talked about the smile sheets and how we can focus on how did that make the learner feel, did they like it or not, but how can we really focus on metrics that matter and keep that evaluation centered around performance? Have you seen any effective implementations of that on your job, or can you come up with and help us determine some practices we can put in place to make sure that evaluation is performance centered? And then finally, one last table. How can we address, just looking at action mapping overall, you're going to get pushback. And we've talked about that in some of our discussion groups in the past. How can we address objections to implementing action mapping in our workplace, in our organization? And maybe even if you're doing like freelance work with individual clients, like they might push back on that based on the history of working with others too. How do we address those objections and challenge those objections so that action mapping is the way we go and proceed in developing whatever kind of solution to this performance problem that there might be? There's your 3 questions. We're going to spend some time focusing on all 3 in those discussion group tables. I'll be jumping around a little bit too. Feel free to jump from table to table. Then we'll come back and share out your awesome ideas and perspectives there as we finish up our last final section on action mapping. I will see you in those tables in just a second, and then we'll come back together in just a moment too. See you soon. All right, well, we had some time to discuss, had some time to go through those final thoughts in this action mapping process as we are coming to the end of it. Again, you're going to implement the action mapping process again when you start another training, or if you get some feedback here and have to go through it again, that's just how it goes. So it's not the end, but we do want to talk about the end processes. So the first question that we had, and I'd love to hear any insight and feedback on, was if we're going to prototype, we want to give direction over distraction, right? So how do we help prototypes keep focus on challenge instead of like the bling? Because again, even us who maybe know better, we might tend to focus on that a little bit more than we probably should. But how do we keep the challenge, the performance issue at the core of the prototype? That one might be a specific question, but if you had any thoughts to share on that, I'd love to have you hop up and share them out.
So we didn't discuss this in the group that I was in, but I do have some experience, particularly around websites and prototyping those from an implementation standpoint. And we get a huge amount of pushback because people would look at it and go, but that's not my branding. I need to see it with my branding. Yes. And one of the things that we've found, and I think there's some studies to support this. So if it's a problem, you can look at some of the prototyping tools may have articles and research on it. So the ones for software prototyping, Figma and Adobe XD and that sort of thing, where there may be resources on it. But what we found was you need really low fidelity prototypes. That is, you use stick figures, you use fonts that look like scroll, you need boxes that aren't necessarily straight, you need as low lo-fi as you can possibly get. And then you need to tell them that you're not going to move forward until they approve it. And that was the only way that I could get through it, because I just keep looking at it going, but it's not orange.
And I understand that. And the cool thing is we have so many, you're right. You mentioned several tools like Figma and XD that they do some really cool visual design work for us for that prototyping stage. Yet, the more maybe kind of what you're saying, and I think Cathy agrees too, so she suggests the same thing. Keep things like black and white, like very simple. Balsamic was one that she used, which is a little bit older of software. But again, that's like no frills. The more distance maybe we form between what we envision and they envision the final product and really what we had before them for the prototype might actually be more helpful in some ways. Like, let's build that distance, because then maybe they'd be more able to see or not see the branding and focus and sit on the challenge, like you're saying.
Yeah, I've used some storyboarding tools with like stick figures and things like that for more scenario-based training. Which I found really useful as well, because it's got that sort of comic book storyboard sort of format, and there are only stick figures in it and little bubbles where they say things, which is not at all what it's going to look like in the end. But it gives people, it's like a movie. Here's the storyboard for it. This is what we're going to do. But it's really. And as you progress, you can actually refine your prototypes and add a little more detail as you go. So as you get closer, like your first couple of iterations can be really low res, and then you move to maybe you add in the orange if that's what it's supposed to be.
Yes.
On the stick figures.
On the stick figure, yeah. No, and that's exactly right. It's not to say like, no, we're going to jump from like this really rough draft looking prototype to a finalized product. It is about iteration, but we have to get the sign off on the challenge, on the decision points, on the concept first, on the actual like performance affecting part of the training, and then we can move forward. It's just not getting caught up on those distractions, which we all do it. I get it. So I appreciate that. That was helpful hearing that some of those insights too, on what you have had to do and what you were forced to do in order to get them to sign off on things. Fantastic. And that's all about the process, and hopefully being on the quicker side to getting approval on the challenge and on the cognitive challenge specifically. That's going to make things so much quicker on the end. Like, we spent all that time in the front end, front loading all the work on making sure the action was focused on first, and now we can have that freedom of iterating and designing and developing and making it look nice. But at the end of the day, this has to come first. Here we go. How do we keep evaluations centered around performance? And we did have some conversation about this as well. And this may be different from the prototyping conversation we just had. But how do we keep evaluation like not just worrying about how a learner might feel, because that's maybe helpful feedback for the instructional designer. But how do we keep it focused on that business performance goal and addressing all that there? What strategies can we take? What does Cathy suggest for us there that we think might be helpful?
Okay. So basically, I'm just going to go off of what Cathy mentions in the book. And I could be wrong, so feel free to correct me, Nathan. So Cathy suggests the similar type of activity-based questions that you wrote for the practice activities when you're evaluating if your client really wants a test. You're not going to write a knowledge test question. You're going to write something similar to what you wrote for the practice-based activity questions. So it'll be very similar but instead, I think Cathy says if they're going to use a job aid on the job, even though it'll be a evaluation question that's similar to the practice activity, you're still going to allow them to look at that job aid because that's what they would do in the real world. But I think what Cathy said is like the biggest difference is you would remove the feedback that you would usually provide in the practice activities, since it would be an evaluation, and then it would be scored however you want to score it. So yeah, you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan.
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Keep things as real world as possible in all regards. That's really been the focus of action mapping. Like, let's not give them something that's so far removed from what they would actually experience, because then you're not going to see that same behavioral change. Same thing with the assessing. If you now do something completely different, well, that's not even going to be tied to the training activity that you already did. So we want to keep things aligned. We want to keep that similar. I think that's a really great point. And at the end of the day, we're talking about evaluation. That's what we're looking for, is the action, the performance. I think you mentioned this. And I think Natalia mentioned it too. In the table we were at, talking about focus on the doing, focus on the doing, not what they know. Again, that's part of that evaluative process, focusing on the knowledge, maybe in some senses, but more importantly on the skill, the behavioral change. We can get caught up with attitude and concerned with how that is, but and Cathy doesn't go into Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation, but she certainly does remind us that that needs to be there. We've been planning for this from the beginning, right? That business goal has been in the center all along. That's what we're trying to get to. The evaluation was built in from the very beginning, and if we don't talk about that all the way throughout, then we're missing a key piece. If we're not leading up to it, it's not an afterthought. It's this is the first thought we honestly have already built and had. So
and just quickly on page 367, Cathy mentions the success case method as a way that we can use to quickly get evaluation results, if I'm not mistaken. So I just wanted to mention that really quickly.
Yeah. If you've been reading the book along with us, especially for those watching the replay too, she does mention Brinkerhoff's book there, the success case model, as you mentioned there, Debbie, and really goes through applying that in the action mapping kind of framework and process. So that's really helpful to read through and see the examples and pieces like that. But it does produce results, which is nice. And what do we do from there with the evaluation? Well, we make changes if we need to, or we can be confident that the process we put in place actually brought those results. So very good. Thanks, Debbie. Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
And just looking at the last questions, I'm running out of time this morning. We do want to consider overall how do we avoid issues with pushback and making sure that we're actually able to implement action mapping. Well, one, it's being an advocate for focusing on the business goal and objective, because if we look at a performance problem and we see that something's not working, well, using that as a rationale will always work in our favor, right? Approaching it with confidence, being more training consultants, performance consultants, rather than order takers, also will help that. And it also goes back to that one key thing that Cathy said in the very beginning, is we have to look at the culture, and we are kind of in the business of, at least in part, changing culture. Now that might be through helping develop training that actually tries to meet performance goals and looks at metrics that matter. But it does come down to that, and making sure that what we have with training and everything else there is definitely focused on performance, right? So as we are thinking about where we go from here, well, one, I want to say congratulations, because you have just finished the book, if you're following along with us. And now if you didn't get to, no worries. We definitely have these replays here for a reason. But what do we go from here? Well, one, I just want to make sure I'm emphasizing this, that one, thanks for reading along with us. It's been a blast going through as a community, getting your insights, seeing all sorts of different areas of the field, and seeing how action mapping has made a difference, or how you plan to make action mapping part of your ID process there. But stay connected with the ID community. Really be looking for more of our live events going on. Please, if you haven't done so already, visit devilinpact.com/ID to join that community at large and have access to all the free resources, and the best of all, the support and guidance and feedback from those aspiring and current IDs who are just trying to grow and develop their skill set and upskill and just make those network connections that help in this journey that we're all on. And hey, keep the suggestions coming. We'll definitely open for ideas on possible future book clubs. But until then, keep searching for those texts, keep reading, keep growing. And again, we're happy to be part of the community here and happy to serve. So reach out to us whenever you have a request, and we'd be happy to make that happen. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you again for you being here. And until next time, have a good day.